this is Friday at the end of a very long parliamentary week in Victoria. The lower house is still sitting, but this afternoon the government will use its numbers to guillotine debate on the state of emergency legislation. This legislation, a grab for power by Daniel Andrews, takes more power for him, more power for the government, more power for the chief health officers. 6 months, additional state of emergency declared. It's our view that Daniel Andrews has had too much power already. He's already botched hotel quarantine. He's botched the contact tracing that was so critical to getting the infections under control with COVID-19. And he's botched the entire response, leaving health workers at risk and the community at risk too. But the legislation that was passed in the upper house on Tuesday will give him more power. It was a very, very close vote. It looked like 1919 until the return of one individual from maternity leave to vote, and that swung the balance to 2019. The legislation passed for the government, so they will have more power. Some of the changes, I think it's important to put on record, will see increased power for the Chief Health Officer. There will be the emergency powers for another 6 months, which will give Daniel Andrews any power he needs in Victoria through the Public Health Act, Public Health and Wellbeing Act, and the ability to declare a whole series of, in effect, regulations. We sought to fight this and said that this was not an appropriate extension. It was too much, it was unchecked. And I say with great power on one side comes the need for accountability, protections, and the ensuring of proper scrutiny and transparency on the other. So we sought to make sure that there were proper tablings of information. We sought to make sure that there were proper checks in balance. Monthly sittings of Parliament were critical to what we were trying to achieve. These were all defeated. The 2019 vote, with just that one more, was sufficient to defeat everything. And the government, scandalously, used gag motions on 4 occasions to stop debate on key clauses and to stop tough questions to the Health Minister that she didn't want to answer. So that gagging, very unusual in the upper house, because it's the House of Review, the place where there's a check and a balance on government power. But the government used its numbers 2019 or more in some cases to gag debate. We think that was undemocratic, and we think that the nature of this bill is undemocratic, giving a huge extension from 6 months to 12 months for these huge state of emergency powers. Give Daniel Andrews sweeping powers across the economy, sweeping powers to close down activities wherever and whatever he chooses and however he chooses his power. So we fought and we fought and we fought. And in the end, it's passed, and it will pass the lower house later today, Friday. But other things did happen this week. A number of doctors came out, and in the end, I've seen as many as 54 senior doctors have signed a letter putting divergent views, different views than that provided by the Chief Health Officer to government, saying the government needs to open up. They can't keep the lockdown going for absolutely ever. And they need to find better ways forward through that process. And I pay tribute to the preparedness of the doctors. And the roadmap that was released to the Herald Sun this week is clearly very close to what Daniel Andrews intends. And I understand that businesses are terribly frightened because they know that their future, their livelihood, the outcomes for their whole concern and their staff, the jobs of their staff, is at risk. So I understand that. Daniel Andrews, of course, has no private sector experience, nor do any of his Gang of 8 cabinet ministers. So you've got a government with no understanding of the private sector, closing down the private sector, damaging jobs and damaging the Victorian economy. I say that Victorians, once a proud group, are now being pushed very far down by Daniel Andrews, and we are the laughing stock, sadly, tragically, of much of Australia now. But I say also that our economy's terrible malaise at the moment, enforced by Daniel Andrews and his orders, is actually having a huge effect across the national economy too. And jobs right across Australia will be affected by the poor results that we're facing. And, you know, the other point here is the mistakes that were made by Daniel Andrews and his government in managing the COVID crisis are the root cause of what we're facing now. The incompetent management of quarantine, the still incredibly chaotic management of contact tracing, which is not up to the standards that we'd expect in other states. And those things, and the failure with health workers, the failure to early on stop the spread of the disease, are actually the cause. It's no use Daniel Andrews constantly pointing the finger at Victorians and individuals. It's actually his fault. It's his government's fault. It's his minister's fault. Huge powers, but they've misused them. They've done damage. And that's one of the reasons we're opposed to giving them even more power. Aside from all that, this week, a documents motion was passed in the upper house. Sounds very obscure, but it is a call for documents. All of the briefings provided to the Chief Health Officer and the Minister for Health on each of the health orders that have been made since back in March. I think people should be able to see those. The community should see them. That transparency is important. It will improve the ability of researchers, public health experts, doctors, to actually make useful suggestions if that information and data is in the public domain. Why Daniel Andrews is fighting the release of these documents, you can only imagine. If he has nothing to hide, he should have nothing to fear, and he should release those documents immediately, as ordered by the upper house. To return as a final point, you know, we face a very difficult set of decisions as a community, but we also say that government decisions have got to be scrutinised properly. The Parliament has got to sit. The Parliament has got to be in the position to demand information. The Parliament has got to be able to criticise executive decisions. Daniel Andrews has closed down the lower house for months and months, and he's done that because he's afraid of the questions. He's afraid of the scrutiny. If the upper house hadn't been able to sit, there would have been almost no scrutiny on this government. And we intend to keep sitting and making sure that we hold the government to account. I thank all of those who have this week worked hard to make the points, both in the chamber, my colleagues and others, but more broadly in the community. Many have been on the radio, many have posted things on Facebook, many have actually put up their hand on a Twitter outing. All of these are important ways of expressing their democratic rights and views, and I think we've got to be prepared to stand up and fight for our democracy, fight for our state, fight for our economy. The line between tyranny and where we are now is narrow, and we need to be prepared to say we're not going to step back, we're not going to roll over, we're going to protect our precious institutions.